Hello, welcome. My name is Drew Coleman. I'm a financial advisor with the Next Level Planning Group. Here we are today for session 9 of our new 10 for 10 series. And it's not so new anymore. We're already here to session 9. And today, I'm excited to share with you today's topic, which is US stock market indices. Before we get into it, I have some standard disclosure slides to share with you. Here they are. US stock market indices. Every day that the market is open, the media regularly reports on the performance of these indices, and we look at them constantly to gauge the economy, to get a sense of how stock markets are doing, and perhaps even to think about how they're doing and perhaps what's happening within our own investment accounts and our own portfolio. And today we're going to look at three. We're going to look at the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the NASDAQ Composite, and the S&P 500 index. Now, what's true about these indices is that you can't actually invest in them. They are constructs representing a grouping of stocks. So they're uninvestable, but there are plenty of mutual funds and exchange-traded funds that are designed to replicate and track the performance of these indices. And those are the things that we can invest in. And so we can invest in funds that track the S&P 500 or the NASDAQ, but we can't actually invest in the index. Let's get started. Let's talk about the Dow Jones Industrial Average. It was launched in May of 1896. It's an index that covers all industries except transportation and utilities. You can see here that the three largest sectors are healthcare, financials, and information technology, representing nearly 60% of the Dow Jones Industrial Average. It holds 30 stocks, and only 30 stocks, and all of them are traded on either the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange. What's interesting is that the 30 stocks are subjectively picked by editors of the Wall Street Journal. Now, the index has changed over the years. The stocks that were originally in the index are no longer in the index, and the index is constantly changing to stay current as a measure of the US economy. GE had the longest running tenure of 110 years, and it was replaced in 2018 by Walgreens Boots Alliance. All the companies in the Dow Jones Industrial Average are highly recognizable, but they are not necessarily the 30 biggest companies in the US. They're just designed to most accurately reflect the US economy, and they're all recognizable companies. We see Apple and Boeing and Johnson & Johnson and Salesforce and Visa and the Walt Disney Company. Now, the Dow Jones Industrial Average is also a price-weighted index. So with this approach, the Dow gives greater weight and greater weighting to stocks with high prices in terms of their contribution to the index. And so it's an average in which high-price stocks represent more in the index. And when we look at the top 10 holdings, what we see is that United Health Group, with a stock price of roughly $540, that's kind of expensive, having the largest weighting in the index. It's at over 10%. What's also interesting is that there are only two technology companies in the top 10, Microsoft and Salesforce. And when we look at the other indices, look at the NASDAQ and the S&P 500, we're going to see a lot more technology companies in the top part of the composition of those indices than we see in the Dow. And that's because this is a price-weighted index, giving more value and more representation to companies with a high price than market cap weighted indices, which we'll see in the other two indices. So now let's turn to the NASDAQ. The NASDAQ was launched in February of 1971. And this is an index calculated by summing the market capitalization of all the constituents in the index. Market capitalization is simply the value of all the outstanding shares of a particular stock. So the outstanding shares, so it's the shares times the share price is the value of all those shares. It's a market cap weighted index of more than 2,500 stocks listed on the NASDAQ stock exchange. And that's a broad index that's weighted towards the technology sector. And the index also includes domestic and international companies. What stands out about the index is that it is highly represented by technology. Technology represents just over 55% of the index. And in a sense, the index can be viewed as a barometer of the tech industry. The index currently holds 3,489 companies. And so the index will have a minimum of about 2,500, but it's really any company that chooses to list on the NASDAQ will be in this index. Companies can list on the New York Stock Exchange, they can list on the American Stock Exchange, they can list on the NASDAQ. And so this index is just a pure composite of the performance of all the stocks that choose to list at the NASDAQ. And right now there's 3,489 of those companies. And this number can rise and fall as a function of the companies that choose to list there or get delisted. What we also see is the top 10 stocks represent over 50% of the index. And so here we see the big difference between the market cap weighted index and like the NASDAQ versus the price weighted index, where here at the NASDAQ, we see that Apple has a big representation, but it even cracked the top 10 at the Dow. Now let's turn to the S&P 500 index. This is the first US market cap weighted index, and it was created in March of 1957. Like the NASDAQ, it's a market cap weighted index of the 500 leading companies in the US. Now, these are not necessarily the 500 largest companies so as to ensure diversification, but it's leading companies in their industries. It can only be US companies, and they must have an unadjusted market cap of 14.5 billion or greater to be considered in the index. Currently, the index has 503 companies, and that's only because three companies have two different share classes, getting to 503. Now, the index is rebalanced and reconstituted quarterly. So every quarter, the index is assessing what are those 500 leading companies that should be inside this index, and are changes necessary. Typically, 20 companies are added or removed each year. And in fact, since 2015, 180 companies have been replaced. So what does this mean? There's been a lot of change since 2015, but it also means that going forward in the next 10 years, there's probably going to be a lot more change too. Compared to the Dow, the S&P 500 can be viewed more as a representation of the US equity markets because it holds more stocks across all sectors. Compared to the NASDAQ, it's really just a comparison of the NASDAQ being all the companies that are listed on the NASDAQ, big and small, whereas the S&P 500 is really the big companies. And you'll see that there's some companies that are listed on all of them. There is Apple and Microsoft, for example, that can be found not only in the Dow, but also the NASDAQ and the S&P 500. The S&P 500 includes all 11 sectors, with information technology having the single largest representation. And like the Dow, the three largest sectors are information technology, healthcare, and financials, and these sectors represent 54% of the index. As I mentioned before, the S&P 500 has changed a lot. And this slide intends to show how much the change has happened in the last 10 years. 10 years ago, the top 25 holdings in the S&P 500 represented about 33% of the index. Now, those same top 25 holdings represent almost 50% of the index. More so, 10 years ago, the top 7 companies only represented about 14% of the index. And now, those top 7 companies represent practically 30% of the index. And so not only has there been a lot of change in the index, as I mentioned earlier, 180 companies have changed since 2015. We're also seeing is that the index is skewing towards the largest of the large companies. Well, I hope you found this session informative. I hope you've gained a better understanding of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the NASDAQ Composite, and the S&P 500 Index. Stay tuned. We've got one more session in our 10 for 10 series, and that will be it for the series. Enjoy.